Hello, today I'm going to be presenting Mary Shelley's 1816 novel Frankenstein and the Modern Prometheus. I'm going to be discussing about how the story serves as a warning to modern scientists today. Frankenstein is a novel about what can happen and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Mary Shelley wrote the novel when she was only 18 years old. She was a young author from England who had an extremely interesting life, but we're not going to get into that too much today. I have much more interesting things to talk about. Let's get right into it. In this presentation, I really want to focus on the subjects of ethics during the creation of artificial consciousness. Frankenstein serves as a warning to modern scientists to consider the ethics of creating artificial consciousness. So let's get right into it. First of all, I want to start this presentation off by discussing the importance of understanding possible repercussions during the creation of artificial life. In Frankenstein, Victor failed to think of any of this, and all he could focus on was the anatomical and scientific portion of the creation. He didn't think of any of the consequences that could come up with the emotional aspect, any of that. All he was focusing on was creating a final project and getting the glory for it. So I'm going to start off this presentation by backing up what I just said with a quote that comes from Victor himself. This is in the novel Frankenstein. Like the archangel who aspired to omnipotence, I am chained in an eternal hell. So here, Shelley is making reference to the book Paradise Lost, which discusses Satan. And Satan in Paradise Lost is a fallen angel who becomes fallen because of his selfish ambition that caused a lot of violence. And this relates a lot to what Victor experiences. His unchecked ambition for success and for fame causes so much violence that it corrupts him pretty much. And that is what caused all the negative things that happened in the book was because of his unchecked ambition, and that caused him to ignore all the possible consequences that could come up from creating artificial life. So much has been done, exclaimed the soul of Victor. Far more will I achieve. Treading in the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold the world the deepest mysteries of creation. So here Victor is saying that his ambition is so strong that he wants to become the next big scientist. He wants to be like the scientist he was reading about in the science books when he was younger. He wants to be in history books. He wants people to be taught about him when he's older. But with this, he fails to look at anything else. Like I mentioned earlier, his ambition was so strong, all he wanted was a fame. He didn't take into consideration what are the negative impacts of what I'm creating? What can I do to prevent those? So, in the world of artificial intelligence, there's one question that often comes up. What precautions are being taken to minimize the dangers of artificial intelligence? And like in the movies here that most of you have probably seen, um, artificial consciousness goes wrong. The violence that it creates is unstoppable because it's a conscious creature. There's nothing you can do to stop it. But since scientists now have thought about the possible consequence of that happening, they were able to put safety nets in place before going through with their research. And those safety nets allowed them to prevent all of this from happening. So I read an interesting article that I'm going to link at the end of the presentation here that discusses all the different algorithms that they were able to put in place to act as safety nets. And I'm not going to talk too much about the technical aspects, but it's really interesting stuff that relates a lot to what Victor is experiencing. Victor didn't look at the possible consequences, so he couldn't put any safety nets in place. So now we're going to talk about moral responsibility. And moral responsibility during a scientific experiment should always take the forefront instead of scientific responsibility. And why moral responsibility is important is because when you're exploring something new, you want it to be used in actual society. And if you don't think about the morals of what you're doing, it'll be useless to society. You can't use it. So there's no point in actually going through and looking into it, right? And this is leads to Victor because Victor wanted to create something human like that could help society by creating new humans. But he never thought about the morals behind this. So he could never actually give it any practical use. And here's a quote to go with that. Seek happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition, even if it be the apparently innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries. And here, this is after Victor realizes all that he's done wrong. He realized that his ambition for success led to violence, and he never thought about the moral responsibility that he had to uphold as a scientist. And that is a really important takeaway for modern scientists today. You must create a female for me, with whom I can live in the interchange of those sympathies necessary for my being. So this quote comes from the creature himself in the novel, and this shows that the creature knows that his creation was morally wrong. Victor failed to look at Maslow's pyramid of basic human needs. And that pyramid is important because Victor wanted to create a human-like creature, but he failed to give it human-like needs. And because of that, his whole existence of the creature was flawed. He couldn't act like a human because he didn't have the same needs that a human would have. And because of that, it caused a lot of violence. And Victor failed to look at that, which was morally wrong on his part. So in 2018, the scientist pictured here, He Jiankyu, managed to do something remarkable in the world of health science. He was able to make um, two twins immune to HIV through the use of genetically modifying embryos before they were born. And he ended up going to jail because of this, since he never thought about the moral complications involved with his discovery. So, since he did research and experimented with embryos before they were born, they weren't able to consent to this research. What if they were born and ended up having disabilities or genetic mishaps? Would this still be morally right? They'd have to, these are actual people we're talking about, and we're experimenting on them without their consent. So that is something that we have to look at when you're creating something living that has an actual consciousness. We have to discuss about the morality of what we're creating. So to conclude, what we went over was that scientists nowadays must uphold moral responsibility when discovering something new. If they don't look at this, it could end terribly, and it will have no use in society because it's so dangerous. And morals exist for a reason. There are rules that society has to follow so that we don't descend into chaos. And it's also important to look at the possible consequences of what we're creating, since the consequences are what allows us to think into the future. If we look at what possible consequences might arise, we can plan according to that and create safety nets like the scientists did with artificial intelligence. And Victor didn't do any of this, and that's where he failed. This is why I believe Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein acts as a warning to modern scientists. She takes what Victor failed at and uses it as a lesson to modern scientists today. Thank you for listening to me, and here are some of my sources. Thank you.